Master Sergeant Eli Hutchins had 90 seconds of blood pressure left when the doors of St. Augustine Memorial blew open, and the gurney came through running. The trauma team scattered into motion, the way trained people do, when a body that bad comes through the door. Fast, loud, half-shouting vitals over each other, while the monitor screamed its flat rising alarm. A gunshot wound to the abdomen, paramedics said, except it wasn't a street shooting, and everyone in that bay who'd worked nights long enough could tell the difference between a street wound and something else. The packing was too clean. The tourniquet was tied with a knot. Nobody learns from a first aid course. Most of the staff hesitated for that half-second crisis always demands. Not Nurse Dana Whitfield. She was already at the gurney before the doors finished swinging. Whitfield had been working nights at St. Augustine for almost 3 years, and in that time, almost nobody had figured her out. She wasn't unfriendly. She said good morning. She remembered which residents took their coffee black. She signed birthday cards in the break room. But there was a wall a few inches behind her eyes that nobody had ever gotten past. And the staff had stopped trying around year 2. The younger nurses called her Wit and said she was unflappable. The older ones, the ones who'd worked enough bad nights to know the difference between calm and something colder, called her something else when she wasn't around. Charge nurse Patricia Nguyen had once said, in a tired moment in the supply room, that Dana Whitfield moved through trauma. Like she'd done it somewhere, the rules didn't apply. She hadn't meant for Whitfield to hear it. Whitfield had been standing on the other side of the shelving, counting saline bags, and she said nothing. She just finished her count and went back to her station. That night, when Hutchins came through those doors bleeding out from the inside, something in Dana Whitfield changed gears so fast it was almost imperceptible, except to anyone watching closely enough, and nobody was. She had him assessed in under 5 seconds. Not a clean gunshot. Internal hemorrhaging stacking on top of it, blood pressure crashing, the kind of compound injury that told a very specific story to anyone who'd ever seen what happens when a man takes a hit and then keeps moving on adrenaline for an hour before anyone gets him help. His oxygen levels were sliding, his pulse was thin and fast in the way that means the body's run out of things to compensate with. The attending on call, Dr. Aaron Voss, was 2 patients deep in the next bay and hadn't even made it to the room yet. 2 residents stood near the gurney in that particular paralysis of people who know enough to be terrified and not enough to act. Whitfield didn't wait for anyone. She snapped on gloves in one motion, called for blood products, in a voice that cut clean through the noise of the room, and had her hands inside the wound, packing before the first resident had finished reading the chart. The younger one started to say something about waiting for Voss. Whitfield didn't even look up. Something about the stillness of her face made him stop talking on his own. It took her under 2 minutes to get the bleeding controlled enough to buy time. Hutchins's pressure started climbing before Dr. Voss even made it into the room. When he did arrive, breathless scanning the monitors, the worst of it had already passed. He looked at the readouts, looked at Whitfield, and didn't say anything useful. Just nodded once, the way doctors do when they've just watched something they don't have a name for. What nobody in that trauma bay noticed, not Voss, not the residents, not the 2 paramedics still filling out their report by the door, was the way Whitfield's hands moved. Not just skilled, rehearsed in a way that didn't come from any nursing program. The kind of movement that gets burned into muscle memory by repetition in places that don't have clean lighting or sterile trays or a doctor 2 rooms over. The kind of movement that comes from doing this work somewhere far from a hospital with no backup coming, and a man's life narrowing down to what your 2 hands can manage. 2 men had come in with Hutchins, what was left of the 4 who'd started that night. They sat in the waiting room in plain clothes that didn't sit right on them. The kind of clothes that look borrowed on men whose bodies were built for something else. They didn't talk much. They watched the double doors the way people watch a road. They expect trouble to come down. The one nearest the door was Staff Sergeant Marcus Doyle. He'd been in his unit for 11 years, long enough to have crossed paths with people from programs that didn't have names you could say out loud. Support staff, whose files didn't exist anywhere he'd ever been cleared to look. Doyle had a habit, mostly unconscious, of cataloging details the way most people breathe. Faces, mannerisms, the particular way someone holds a weapon or sets their feet under stress. It wasn't a skill he'd trained for. It was just what 11 years of staying alive had carved into him. When the trauma bay doors swung open for a few seconds, someone wheeling in supplies, Doyle caught a glimpse of the nurse working on Hutchins. Her sleeve had ridden up as she reached across the bed, and for less than 2 seconds Doyle saw the inside of her right forearm. A scar, not the kind from an accident. A long straight line, old and pale, with 3 small intersecting marks cut precisely along it. Deliberate, healed clean, the kind of scarring that comes from a procedure, not an injury. He'd seen exactly one mark like it before, years back on a contractor who'd worked alongside his unit for 4 days, and was never spoken of again once the operation ended. Same configuration, same precision. He didn't say a word. He looked down at the floor and let his mind do what it always did when something classified rubbed up against ordinary life. Pull threads, cross-reference. Wait. He glanced at the man beside him. Gave the smallest nod a person can give. They both understood without saying it that the nurse working on their sergeant was not entirely who badge on her scrubs said she was. If you've ever believed the most dangerous people in any room are the quiet ones nobody bothers to ask about, you already understand exactly where this is going. This is the kind of story the secret nurse exists to tell. So if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. Because there's a lot more buried in this one than a hospital shift. Hutchins made it through the night. By 3:30 in the morning, he was out of immediate danger. Vitals holding the particular stillness that follows a body that has just barely won an argument with death. The ICU nurse who took over his care later remarked almost offhand that whoever had stabilized him in the field and in that trauma bay clearly had experience, well beyond standard hospital training. She said it like a compliment. It was really a question, he answered it. Whitfield finished charting, clocked her notes and went back to her rounds. She didn't check on Hutchins again. Not because she didn't care, but because she'd learned somewhere along the way that caring too visibly in certain rooms was its own kind of risk. Doyle didn't sleep. He sat in that waiting room until the windows went from black to the flat gray that comes right before sunrise, turning the scar over in his head from every angle, the way he did with anything that didn't fit cleanly into a box. He had what amounted to a photographic memory for marks that mattered. The kind of thing you can't unsee once you've learned what it means. The way a person who speaks a rare language can't help but understand it when they hear it in a crowd. That scar belonged to something. A program, a unit, a designation he'd only ever referenced in passing by people 2 ranks above him, who were careful never to say more than they had to. He took out his phone and opened a thread on an encrypted channel his unit used for things that weren't strictly operational. He typed, "Anyone know who's working nights in the ER at St. Augustine Whitfield? Female. Right forearm. 3 marks on a line. You'll know it if you've seen it." He didn't describe it any further than that. Some things you don't put into words, even in a channel that's supposed to be secure. The reply came back in just under half an hour. 1 line from a contact 2 ranks up, whose name Doyle wouldn't have said out loud even in a locked room. Don't ask her anything. Don't acknowledge it and be grateful she was the one on shift. Doyle read it 3 times. He thought about Hutchins on that table. He thought about the 2 minutes it had taken her to turn a man from dying to stable. He thought about the way her hands had moved. Not the motion of someone executing a learned skill under pressure, but the motion of someone for whom that skill had stopped being a skill years ago and become something closer to the same way breathing stops being a decision. He'd seen that kind of movement in operators. He had never once seen it in a hospital, on a woman wearing scrubs with a cartoon bandage sticker stuck to her badge holder that some kid in pediatrics had clearly given her that week. At 6 in the morning, shift change started. Whitfield came through the unit to hand off her patients to the day staff. She walked past the waiting area without looking at the 2 men sitting there. Doyle stood up anyway. He hadn't planned what he was going to say, which wasn't like him. "You saved my sergeant's life last night," he said. It was the only thing that felt honest enough to say out loud. Whitfield stopped and looked at him. Not the way most people look at soldiers in a hospital waiting room. Not with the strained gratitude or discomfort civilians usually perform when they don't know what else to do with their faces. She looked at him the way you look at someone standing a little too close to a truth they shouldn't have access to, and Doyle could tell she was running calculations behind her eyes, deciding in real time exactly how much of that truth this moment required. "He's tough," she said. "He did most of it himself." Doyle nodded. He let 2 seconds pass. Then quietly, without glancing down at her arm, he said, "Somebody I used to work with says hello. Said to tell you the program doesn't forget the people who served it." Whitfield went very still. It was the particular stillness of someone hearing a language they hadn't heard, spoken aloud in a long time, recalibrating to the sound of it. Nothing on her face moved in any way a casual observer would have caught. But Doyle wasn't a casual observer, and he saw something pass behind her eyes. Not fear. Not guilt. Something older than either of those. The specific weight carried by people who gave everything to something that asked for their silence in return, and then sent them home to disappear quietly. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she said, "Tell him the program never had to remember me. I remembered it just fine without any help." She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and walked toward the exit. The early light coming through the glass doors of St. Augustine caught the inside of her forearm as she pushed through them, and for 1 second the scar was visible. Pale, deliberate, carrying the weight of a story no after-action report would ever fully account for. Doyle watched her walk out into the parking lot. Behind him, the other man let out a slow breath. Neither of them said anything else for a long while. Because there are people who serve in ways that never make it into a citation, who carry what they gave into ordinary jobs and quiet shifts that nobody thanks them for, who bleed for something, and then, when that something asks them to vanish, simply do, without complaint, without needing anyone to know. Dana Whitfield walked out into the morning. She was just a nurse. She had always been just a nurse, as far as anyone at St. Augustine would ever be able to prove. And that more than anything else about her was the whole point. These are the people nobody writes the headlines for, we write them here. If this one stayed with you, you know exactly why the secret nurse exists. So stick around, because the next one's already waiting, and it cuts even deeper than this.